Do only the cool kids get book deals? How should a cookbook author balance various content creation? And how does someone get to be a guest on our podcast? Today, we're answering these questions from our listeners as well as a few more. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Molly Stevens, and today I am here with the whole gang, Andrea Nguyen, Kate Leahy, and Kristin Donnelly, to kick off the 4th season of Everything Cookbooks and celebrate Cookbook Month. Hello.
Hey.
So good to all be together.
Right.
Like the old days. I feel like it's a bit of a milestone for us. Episode 64, right?
I know.
Did you think we'd get here?
Never.
Of course.
When we started this podcast, March 2022, I wasn't really even sure about podcasting in general, but that people would tune in, that people would listen, that people would subscribe, or whether we'd want to stick with it. And here we are.
Here we are.
Amazing.
Still talking.
Still talking.
Plenty to say.
Finding more things to say. That's the thing, right?
I know.
Right? Well, I often think about our origin, and we've talked about this a couple times on the podcast, but that we were meeting virtually for years before we even started the podcast, just having conversations, sort of professional support group, turned friends, but creating a community around what the work we do, because we're all working in our own separate spaces. And from the beginning, we wanted the podcast. I went back and listened to our trailer. I think as Kristin, you say that we want this to be a two-way street. We want to hear from you. And it's cool. We hear from our listeners.
Yeah, it is cool. I mean, we do it for listeners, right? We do want to hear from you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. October is Cookbook Month. So this is when we like to relaunch a new season. So we thought that since we started as community for each other, we talk a lot about community, that we'd sort of focus on community for this next batch of episodes. And with that in mind, we reached out to listeners to ask me anything. I guess it'd be ask us anything. We got some pretty great questions, as we always do.
I think one of the cool things about Everything Cookbooks is that the listenership is quite varied. I think that when we started out in 2022, we didn't know who would come and listen, but we knew what interests us. And the kinds of questions that we're getting from different people really informs that cookbooks and cookbook making is not just for authors and editors and, folks who are in the biz per se.
Right.
It attracts a lot of folks. And I think that speaks to what cookbooks are and hell, what Everything Cookbooks is. So, this is amazing.
It is. And I think, Kate, you and I both started in professional kitchens. And,
Right.
when there's cooking, if you're cooking for people, there's a community element involved, but also for anybody writing cookbooks. I mean, you're writing it for people, for your audience, for your community. And I would love to, at some point, and maybe not today, to talk, especially Andrea and Kristin, about what you've done so intentionally creating your communities through your newsletters and all of your various platforms. It's something I don't think we talk enough about. And we did with that Carla Lally music episode, was finding your people kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And because it is important to figure out who is listening, who is reading. Anyway, so all those people out there listening and tuning in, thanks. We love you. Let's do some questions. The first one here is from Martin, who is, I think we've heard from Martin a couple times, but he's starting his journey as a cookbook author. And his question is, it's a good one. How do authors balance cookbook writing while keeping up with the blog, newsletter, socials?
Called dog paddling, Martin.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd love to hear from Andrea on this because I feel like this is like, she's in this cycle all the time.
Oh, man. It's like, Martin, I believe, is a baker.
Yep.
And we know each other from Substack. He has a Substack newsletter. He's a very talented, creative baker. And, it's hard because you're juggling different communities and trying to make sure that they know what you're up to, that they're excited and they're engaged. At the same time, you're also huddling in your kitchen and by your laptop writing very quickly. But, I think to answer your question, Martin, you really have to just schedule your time. And I try to. I'm not very good at it, but you just need to carve out time. Certain amount of work for the blog newsletter, a certain amount of work for the social, certain amount of work, but most of the work for the book. At the end of the line, the book is permanent. The other stuff isn't. You can undo the stuff online. You can't undo the stuff in your book so easily. So I would not fool around too much on the blog, newsletter, and socials, the digital aspect of your work while you're creating a book. What about you, Kristin?
Yeah, he does have the challenge where I think he's trying to build his audience while also writing the book, because he won the Great American Baking Show. But at the same time, I think his social following, he's starting with a smaller following. So I understand that stress. I was thinking a couple things. One is feeling free to show some behind the scenes of the bookmaking and using that as content, you know, what you feel comfortable or what you feel is okay to share. And then since he is trying to build, it does seem like, you know, short form video is the thing that helps people grow the fastest. So if there's an opportunity to do short form video, even if it's twice a week, like just trying to put stuff out there that will, you kind of know is stuff that people really like, and trying to do that at least twice a week.
I wouldn't do it while you're writing the book, though.
You wouldn't?
No.
Maybe while it's in production.
Totally. You guys are so fucking, excuse my language, so damn distracting. It's like that rabbit hole you go down, and all of a sudden it's like 2 hours later, you're, as my husband says, why are you still staring at your phone, editing that reel? I mean, you know.
It's so true. Yeah. It's true.
Okay. I mean, let's just be honest. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
And so you have plenty of time for that promotion stuff, and you can schedule it out. I'm so old school, man. And I get so worried about my words.
Right. Kristin, I often think of you as someone who's really good at, you used a word for it. It's not relentless, but I can't remember your schedule. It's like,
ruthless.
okay, from ruthless. Yes. Ruthless about your scheduling. And so it's, 2 hours today, it's this, and, to really block it out. And if you can block it out and it's book production time and you can carve out 2 hours to do something, but you have to stick your, the problem is the editing takes longer, you get drawn in, then you're off schedule. So if you're not able to really be ruthless about your schedule, I also think about the interview we had with Alicia Kennedy about it. This notion of batching, like you could work on stuff before you release it. Like, so say it's a Saturday, you're it's not working on your book production, but you're going to spend the day creating posts for the next, 3 weeks or whatever it is, or you just take a break. I mean, I'm certainly not one to give advice on how to manage your social media content, but to be deliberate about it, whatever the decision is, and to not let it nag at you. Like if you're constantly feeling guilty because you're not doing it, you need to let that go and focus on the book.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think even if you just like come up with like a reduced cadence that you feel good about, like if you're posting on Substack once a week, could it be every other week or, something like that?
So you don't just disappear.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Substacks that I subscribe to, when there's a book project involved, oftentimes they're very upfront about taking the next 2 weeks off because they're really getting into the weeds with their book. And I think that's also a great way to be open and honest with your readership. So I'm working on this thing. It's great. I'm going to take a little bit of break, but I'll be back. Those kinds of things, I think, also just make you feel like a real person and not a machine.
Yeah, too. And the Substack is a way to just be honest about what's going on. Substack offers more humane depth opportunity.
Yeah, for sure.
Than Instagram. And if someone like Martin's like sitting there, editing, or like his kitchen's a mess or whatever, that's you can write about that. It's not going to be pretty for Instagram. But Kristin, I mean, like being a parent teaches you to schedule, right? I mean,
oh my gosh. So when I worked at Food and Wine, I worked with this woman, Kate Headings. I love her. I don't know if she's listening, but she had 2 school-age children when I had no children. And she left every day, 5 o'clock, 5:30, whatever it was. Many of us were there later. She did get in a little earlier, but it didn't matter. She was just so efficient. She always got her work done. She was also really good at choosing projects that were right in her wheelhouse. So she wasn't totally stressed out all the time. Whereas I was more junior and I'd be like, I'll do that. And it was like always a learning curve. So I did learn a lot from Kate watching her. Then when I became a parent, you're just forced to when you're on and you're off and all of that.
Yeah. So I guess the answer is how? It's hard. You try.
Right.
Try strategies. Yeah.
So it looks like we have another really good question. This one is anonymous. Are publishers realistically looking for authors who are industry insiders? Basically, the question is there a cool kids club Are those the folks who were getting the book deals, and what about the rest of us? I think that's kind of the question. And it's a really good one. And I think it's one that all of us have probably internally asked if we haven't necessarily asked that out loud. So what do we think about this question?
When you're breaking into an industry, if you are not one of those industry insiders, meaning that you know people, you have a network, you're always going to be looking in from the outside. You're always going to be standing on the sidelines. We've all started out there, right? Publishers aren't necessarily looking for that right now. I think it's, again, going back to that notion of platform. There are people who are doing things on social media as influencers who are getting book deals. They're not necessarily industry insiders to publishing. They're not like having their work, in magazines and newspapers and such, but they just have cultivated a following. Now, whether or not that sustains them for a career is a whole different question. They may have an interest in writing a book just to just show the world I'm like the best cook ever, in 30 seconds. But publishers are looking all over the place right now for potential authors. So I think it used to be that you needed to be an insider, but food media is always looking for the overlooked, unknown talent, just like every other industry.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not close a door on that notion of the underdog being someone who can be successful.
Yeah.
One thing about cool kids is that whoever are the cool kids now, in 5 years, it'll be a whole different group of cool kids. So sometimes it's not a good thing to necessarily be in the cool kids club if you are, because then you have that pressure of what happens if I have this big hit and then everything else drops off after that. So I think one of the ways to look at it is slow and steady wins the race. We've talked about that a lot. And, just meeting your people and meeting more people and having also, and I think this is something we talk about a lot too, is if there is a thing that you're very interested in, whatever that topic is in the food world, it does help to stick with that for a while. That's something that I have not done.
Yeah, same.
And I don't necessarily have to as a co-author, but if I were to be a solo author, I would be hitting that food and wine thing over and over and over again, because that would be my niche. And it's easier to have a long-term career if you do have that niche that you're really focused on.
There has been a little bit of a switch, I guess, in the last decade where, it used to be so much about who was on TV, Food Network, et cetera, and food editors were often behind the scenes. You never saw their face. You didn't know who they were. And then with video, especially YouTube, publications started putting their editors more out there, and they did become these more famous household names. And I guess that's a lot of what we're seeing, books from people who did work in publishing who are now somewhat famous. One thing I was thinking is when you have a publishing background, you often are always meeting people in publishing, and then they also know you can do the work.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a little bit of bias. I will freely admit that there is bias in publishing, where publishing people like to work with publishing people because they know they can do the work. And when they can do the work, it makes their jobs easier. And then now we have this phenomenon of publishing people who then are actually also famous, big platformed people. But I also agree with Andrea that there are so many ways in. I don't know. I look at what other people do as inspiration, but I try to just focus on my own stuff and not really worry about who's in what club.
And I think, yes, publishers are going to publish names, the Molly Bozes, the Ina Gardens, the books they know are going to sell. That's an obligation, their business sense. They know they can sell hundreds of thousands of copies of those books. But every publisher, book editor I've ever spoken with, they're also looking for, as Andrea said, a new voice, an emerging voice, somebody who has not yet been discovered. I mean, that's a big coup for an editor to bring someone in who is going to, but they have to know that they can do the work.
And the other thing is that we focus on folks who are well known, like Ina Garten and the folks from Bon Appetit, of a certain generation of Bon Appetit. Bon Appetit got a new editor-in-chief, Jamila Robinson from Philadelphia, and we'll see how she impacts things. But Bon Appetit aside, y'all, I mean, there are just a handful of folks who stand out, right? As the sparkling stars, right? But there are tons of cookbooks published each year, hundreds, if not thousands of cookbooks on so many different levels. And I think that if you want to make a cookbook, you be realistic about where you're going to fit in and how you're going to get into the industry. And, you just want to make that book. If you're ambitious and you want to just like really get out there and, sell a bunch, then yeah, like Kristin said, and what Kate says, like get to know people in the industry.
Yeah.
And we'll have a couple of interviews coming up soon with people who have either gone it alone with publishing or have gone with a small press. So, stay tuned and hear about alternative journeys in publishing.
And the other thing about Cool Kids, just before we get to the next question, is that I remember our conversation with Bonnie Benwick, and she talked about the Joanna Gaines book that, the best-selling cookbook that food media ignored. So back to Andrea's point, like, look at a lot of different sources. Like, if you keep looking at the same source, you'll find the same names getting mentioned again and again. But the range of cookbooks is so vast. There's room for a lot more people.
Right.
Here's a question from Claudia Boutin. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your surname, Claudia. Claudia asks, how much does the writing influence a book's design, and what is that process?
I love this question.
How much do you think about the book's design as you are writing?
I don't think of it as I'm writing. That's not true. I think of it more as I get towards the end of the manuscript. But it definitely, if it's a good design, the writing has influenced the design. That would be my quick take, because a poor design doesn't take into account that, these headnotes are long, or maybe there are these sidebars that could be pulled out, or, there are all these elements that we've talked about. But good design very much looks at how the recipes are laid out, how much text there is. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Going from magazines to books, in magazines, it's often so design forward that you don't start with the design and then right to the layout. And so when I switched to books, they were like, don't even think about the design. Like, just write what you want, and then we'll deal with design later. And that was very refreshing. But I think it can depend on the publisher. There are some publishers who are a little more, they bring in a designer sooner into the project, like Chronicle Books. I know they do that. It'll still be led by the author or led by the words, but it seems like they want to get a sense of how long your headnotes tend to be so they can create that design earlier and have them work together. Yeah. And I know, Andrea, you've had some interesting experiences with writing and design.
Yeah. So with Evergreen Vietnamese, my editor, Lorena Jones, asked me really interestingly during the design phase, she said, send me your longest headnote, shortest headnote, and something in between. I mean, like recipes, sorry, not just headnotes, but recipes. She wanted to figure out a way that for us to design all of that in. And then I also sent her some emotional descriptors about how I wanted the book to be calm and inviting, and it's about plants. So, and it's about us finding calm in this time of our lives in 2023. And so that's how we came up with that design. But, at the end of the line too, we had to cut a lot of copy just to like shoehorn things in. So even though like you're told, just write, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to write. And it's like now 100, edited, and it's now 110,000 words. You're like, I can't fit that in. Maybe 90, 1,000 words. And then you start being ruthless, Kristin.
I would say, I think what Claudia is asking is actually really interesting to think about right now, because I do think there's a shift that books are so visual. And I think in the past, I would have just written without thinking about the visuals. But I'm thinking of something Matt Rodbard said on the interview that Molly and Kristin did. He really is thinking about the design while he's writing. He's thinking about what images he has. A current project I'm working on, I'm not necessarily thinking about the design in precise ways, but I'm thinking about the photos that I know we have, the photos in country and the photos in the studio and the flow. And that's really helping me kind of think, all right, well, I want the opener of this chapter to be really short so we can have a 2-page spread of an in-country photo. I want the head notes to be not too long. So I'm going to do Andrea's trick and have like little like tips buried somewhere else so the recipe can breathe a little bit. So I'm thinking about those logistics earlier on than I think I did in the past. And I think it's also just helping me visualize what this finished product will be, so there won't be so much work on the back end. And this is different too because it's a co-authoring project. So it's something that you want as few sort of roadblocks to get everybody on the same page as possible. So that's another kind of thing. And a lot of, it's working with a chef. Chefs are visual people. So it's also kind of making sure that everyone's on the same page with aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you something, Kate and Kristin.
Yeah.
When you're co-authoring, the chef's talking to you or restaurateurs, and they're like, I want to make the big book. Are they talking oftentimes about the words more or the pictures more?
Pictures. Not always, but I would say, okay, when I worked with Mindy Siegel on Cookie Love, it was all about the recipes and the stories.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't even at the photo shoot, which happened after we had turned in the manuscript. This was really specifically about making sure she got her stories and recipes down on paper, which was a feat in and of itself. As many people know, like just getting the words down is, it's a lot. But I would also say that I've worked with co-authors in the past where they don't have any comments on anything until they see the layout. And then they have so much to say. So that doesn't happen anymore. I'm really much more like, let's bring design on early. Let's get a mood board that everyone agrees on. Let's have meetings with the, graphic designer and do more of that chronicle book style where you do have just a sense of like where we're going with this design so that you don't have those like, oh, well, I wish there had been more pictures at the end when it's too late.
Yeah.
Right.
I think in my case, it's always been story-led, but I've often worked with people who already have an established brand. So they're bringing that with them, but they don't necessarily obsess about it. I think there's just an understanding that the book will have some sense of that brand. So it's actually more been about the writing content.
I just recalling episode 11 with Alice Chow, we talk about design. So
yeah, that's a good one.
Claudia might want to go back and check that out.
And I'm currently working with Alice right now, and it's a delight because we
Nice.
are talking both back and forth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it helps.
Yeah. One of my first books was Right to Fit. So that taught me
cool.
a lot because every recipe had to fit on a page. And so there's some sense of, are your head notes all going to be about the same length or not? Something beyond just the photos and the illustrations, but how do the words fit on the page is something to consider.
For sure. Very satisfying to cut things to fit.
It is.
I know. I love cutting. All right. We got a question here from Phil Bosco of At Paired Pints. Phil asks, how do you find the balance between telling a story and the recipe? Do you approach it thematically? For example, recipes that pair with Pilsners. Should I tell a story for each recipe or just the theme? So Phil's clearly establishing this Paired Pints platform and building it. And so the question is, how do you balance story and recipe?
I love this question.
I love the alliteration of all those P's.
I know. And Phil, I call him Pill of Paired Pints.
And Pilsners.
We're renaming you Pill, Phil.
This is essentially a very interesting single subject kind of question, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're doing a single subject treatment, Phil, and you want to give your readers information so that it pulls them in and hooks them and finds your recipes to be unique and worthwhile. So I would tell the story, and I imagine you're suggesting the story about the recipe or the background about the particular Pilsner. But you can vary it up, you don't want to just like, this recipe is about blah, 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 blah. We have our pet peeve about starting head notes with the word this.
Yeah.
You have to mix it up.
Which I've also done, but
yeah. No, I have
Sorry.
two.
You can use this, just not in every single
single one. Yeah.
But you don't have to tell a story for every single recipe, but you
I
can
agree.
you mix it up. And again, I think this is a great question. Following design, the design will inform that because your recipes are going to vary in length. And if you are, fitting things on one page or you just have so many pages that go into your book, that will tell you how long those head notes can be.
Yeah. And if you have a great story about a certain recipe, tell that story. If you have another recipe that you don't have a great story, don't make one up. Don't contrive something just because you told a story here. It doesn't have to be the same. The head note doesn't have to have the same approach. I think it's better if it mixes it up, right? If there's some variety, it's like this story is this recipe is a family favorite. That's great. But unless it's a family cookbook, not every recipe needs to be a family favorite.
It also sounds like something like pairing Pilsner. I mean, Kate, you just did a book all about pairing. I mean, so you might have a chapter that's about pairing Pilsner, have a chapter opener that talks about some general notes about Pilsners. how to pair Pilsners, what makes a good Pilsner, that sort of thing. And then get into, with each recipe, why it might pair. You can get a little more nitty gritty. I don't know. What do you think, Kate?
You took the words out of my mouth. That's exactly what I was thinking, is that if it's a chapter on Pilsners, of course you don't want to be redundant in all your head notes, but there will be specific things about each recipe in a chapter on Pilsners that make it particularly good with Pilsners. And you can even get specific in if there's regional Pilsner styles. Maybe a couple of recipes really are from this one area and they are excellent with this recipe because you give people the because. But there also could be something that you put in the recipe that is, a tip on how to make it, if it's something, or maybe it's cooking with beer in that particular recipe. And you can also give a nod to that. So you can mix up with technique, with story, and with, if you really want to focus on that theme, why is this recipe in this book? That'll help you to figure out what the head note should be. But I agree with everyone. Just you don't need this like beautiful story for every recipe. You just need a reason why it's in this book.
Yep. I love that you're talking about chapter openers, and we've talked about this both in design and in this question, because not every cookbook has to have a chapter opener, but it's an opportunity to, and as you're thinking about design and layout and organizational structure, wire these chapters together. And sometimes you can cover a lot of ground by writing a chapter opener to explain, as you said, what are some of the general themes of pairing with Pilsners, if that happens to be the chapter. And then that frees you up to do something else in the head notes. A good one to think about.
You love everything cookbooks, right? And we love making it for you. If you're ready to take this relationship to the next level, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There you'll find links to our new merch, including the coziest t-shirts and sweatshirts, and our bookstore, where we earn commission from every book you buy. You can also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Again, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support to find all the ways to show us love. And thanks for listening. So we have a question from Amisha Gurbani of At the Jam Lab, and she just asked us to talk more about promotion and specifically when to start and who we might approach to help with promotion. It's a really big question.
It's a moving target, isn't it? Because I feel like what worked 2 years ago, which wasn't that long ago, has shifted and things keep shifting. And Andrea, I'm curious to know what you think, but I feel like the time frame for promotion has changed, where if you start promoting a year before your book's out, it's way too early. You can give people a tease, but people have such short attention spans. They want to know when they can hit buy and get that book in their, mailbox, or go to the store and it's already on the shelf. If you tell them a year before, it's like, oh, my book will be out in April 2024. No, it doesn't move the needle. It's good people know you're working on the book and give them that peek behind the curtain. But,
I mean, you can start laying the groundwork,
Yes.
I will say, a year out.
Absolutely.
You might not talk about it publicly, but if you somehow know, you might be able to get a story in a big magazine or even certain kinds of television, you can start laying that groundwork a year out, or at least making a plan a year out. But I agree with you, Kate. And yeah, I'd love to hear from Andrea since she just went through this whole thing.
It has shifted so much and it will keep moving.
Yeah.
So I'm about to go into production or finishing production of a book. I typically will look at when a book, gets sent off to print, because that's when I'm like, all right, now check that off my list. I'm going to tell people that I just crossed this milestone. And that's when I also talk to my publisher and the marketing and publicity folks about what's going on. What are they observing and what's working? Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. To tell you the truth. And then I'm also looking at what other authors are doing, authors that I think resonate with my interests and work, because not every author and platform size, because, they're authors, we've talked about this, you're coming at different levels, okay, of notoriety. And so, you want to figure out what's going to work for you, and you can get, what's going to engage people. And it just is so crazy right now because the algorithms on social media have changed. And let's just talk about how Instagram is a moving target. And you don't know, but there's Substack, there's all kinds of different places where you can publicize books, and video's king now, but who knows what video is going to be 2 years from now. So you really have to be open-minded and flexible. We have had episodes in the past, episode 14, on how to promote your book. There's Stephanie Moon. We did like the event with her, right?
Right.
Yeah. But even her, I would say Stephanie Moon, her Instagram, she's just always giving some really good tips for promoting books and even promoting way before as well as after your book comes out. So I think she's just a good person to follow.
Yeah.
I would follow you, Kristin, as well, because you do a great job of sharing things you've learned. And like, because this question, she asked who to approach. I think you just sort of start to follow some people who might give you ideas of who to approach, because there's a lot of people out there who you can hire to help you.
I would say also, Andrea, you're finding your Substack community, and Kristin, you are too. And, in the old days of book promotion, there were sort of blog tours where you would, do guest posts for people. Now Substack's the new blogging. So if there are certain Substacks in the genre you're working in, what if, they did a Q&A with you? Then it's a very targeted audience. 2,000 people read a Substack, that's getting into their inbox. That has a lot more chance of getting engagement than, say, somebody getting 2,000 hits on a video on Instagram. Probably because you have somebody who's just a little bit more engaged in the content, has more time to spend with it. So I don't know. I feel like there's just more opportunities for going back to what worked in the past in a way, just in a different format.
There's also this newsletter, speaking of Substack, called Publishing Confidential. The writer, she comes from the marketing side of publishing, and she's talk about ruthless. I feel like everything she's like, this does not work.
Really?
Blurbs do not work. This does not work. This does not work. And basically, like, what works is like NPR. Also podcasts. But she's not specifically talking about cookbooks, so it's a little bit different. But it's fun to read, if a little stressful, maybe. But
oh, I'm definitely going to follow that.
We'll put it in the show notes.
You want to think about it as fun too, because there are things that have worked in the past that may not work now. And, I throw things up on Instagram and I'm just like, why isn't it like reaching so many people? And then, but you just got to like think of it as a very fast moving stream. Sometimes it's a river. And then you just put your little leaf down there of content and let it float away to the ocean. And then you put another one in. And the terrible thing is that the content that you make seems very disposable. This is going to be upfront. And then you're just like, what did I spend all that time on? But you know what? Someone's seeing it. And I oftentimes wonder, like, if people are looking at it, but they're not liking it and stuff like that, just because there's just so much going on and so much moving information. So social media can be like cruel.
If you let it be.
If you let it be. So just like let it go, try different things. And also, the question is when to start and then also when to stop. And I think that for me personally, I try not to be relentless to my community. It sometimes seems very creepy, but we say no one's going to be better at promoting your work than you. So always remember that, even though you feel like, oh God, I just wrote this book and now I have to promote it too. It's like, yes, you do.
Yes, you do.
And the other thing is like, it's a long play. Just let it go and keep working on it because people know about things. They need to get reminded. There are a lot of other distractions in our lives. So be patient and also have fun with it because the hard part was getting the book deal.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
I really like what you said about the sort of like the old way of doing things, because I think about advertising, like TV advertising or newspaper. You couldn't track that stuff, right? Maybe like over time you would see sales go up, but sometimes there's just something like people did ads for brand awareness. And a lot of times that's what you're doing as an author. It's not everything you're doing is going to lead to a sale. So even though I do love Publishing Confidential and she's like, this does not work, she's saying this does not immediately translate to sales, but it might work in an overall picture where you're creating this like awareness about yourself that over time, has people falling in love with you and then hopefully will translate to a sale.
That's a really good point, Kristin. The brand awareness, because that's now on authors. It's really on authors. You have to be an author on the internet. You have to be somebody that people can find. But we're talking a lot about online. I'm curious to know, has the importance of events changed? Because I think several months ago, I would have said events really aren't things that move the needle. But now I'm wondering, because in person just has so much more impact, are events much more valuable than ever now? I'm not sure.
I love events.
Yeah. A thing I want to say about events is consider them in smaller markets we focus a lot on like the big cities, but think about the second tier cities and think about your, depending on where you're from.
I felt like during the pandemic, we were just so starved for contact with other humans, and the whole hugging thing, like you can really touch. And so with Evergreen Vietnamese, I mean, people just packed all of my events, and it was just this outpouring of love, of cooking, of content, of heritage, of ideas and community. And it's something I had never seen before. You only have so much time when you're talking to someone in a signing line, and they save up their stories to tell you about how much your work impacted them.
Yeah.
And I hug. I'm just like, forget it. I'm just like hugging you.
But you mentioned the pandemic, and it goes back to Andrew too, to what you're saying about, putting the leaf in the stream and letting it go. But there's a lot you cannot control. You cannot control what's happening in the world when your book comes out. So the idea of having your promotion, focusing it on a very narrow window can be problematic, because there's a storm, there's a pandemic, there's a national crisis, an international crisis. All these things will take people's attention. In many cases, rightly so. And so you want to be able to just roll with that, say, okay, well, I was supposed to go on book tour, but I didn't because this, and this happened. Or I went and nobody came because everyone was preoccupied with this and that. So to just roll with it and say, oh, you don't have to, you don't have only this short window to promote your book. You can do it for a very long time.
Correct. And talking about different cities aside from the big ones, San Francisco, New York, LA, Seattle, I'm going to go to Philly in October. And I'm going to do events there. They're having this really beautiful series of events that go on for 2 months called Cookbook Conversations that the Dames Escoffier of Philadelphia is putting on.
Nice.
It's mostly women who are backing it with their female authors as well as restaurateurs and stuff. And so cookbooks are everywhere, and cookbooks are being sold in many places, not just traditional bookshops. And so there are event opportunities in places that you may not think of. Yeah, I'm going to do an event with a bakery.
Cool.
In Oakland.
That's fun.
Yeah. So you can be creative, because a lot of people are into cookbooks these days.
Yeah. Speaking of people being into cookbooks, I love this question from Lucy Loves Books. How do we feel about cookbooks in the library, and how do they get there? As in, who buys them?
Great question.
Librarians do.
Libraries are great. I think what Lucy's asking is, do authors not like their book in a library because people would check it out and not have to buy it? But I'm thinking libraries have so much buying power that if libraries across the country buy a cookbook from an author, that author's sales go up. And plus, you check out the book from the library, maybe you cook a couple things to see if you like this book. But if you keep having to check it out from the library, then you need to buy this book or ask for it for a birthday. So I think it's a huge score to get, say, a great review in one of the library trade magazines. It's great to be in a library. Librarians are awesome. That's, I don't know, get off my soapbox now.
I once did an event years ago, a demo in front of group of librarians for the American Librarian Association convention in Anaheim.
Nice.
Sunday morning. And I had heard that they were party animals. Next to the firefighters and the policemen, apparently the librarians go out the night before. And so when they asked for my time slot, I said I wanted to be late morning, because I know these people may be probably hungover. And it was the most fun event. I know librarians as friends. They recommend books to people. Mm-hmm. They're among one of the best spokespeople for you, because people want recommendations. And there's at least one library in every community. So to get your books into the library also means that you can't have a paperback, is my understanding.
You can, but I think there's certain things that I think it's more like, say, if you write romance and your book is out in paperback, a library has to get the paperback. But chances are, if your cookbook is a paperback, there might be a specific for library binding that your publisher can do specific for the library market, and it might cost the library a little bit more to bring it in. There was a really great interview on a podcast called Bad on Paper, and they brought in a librarian and just asked her all these questions about books in the library. So we'll put that in the show notes.
Let's find a librarian.
Yeah. And it was fascinating.
Let's bring a librarian on to the podcast. That'd be awesome. awesome.
Well, if anyone has contacts, DM us.
I mean, I go to my local library all the time, and I also always check to see if my books are there. And if they're not, I donate a copy.
Oh,
Just because it's my community and I know whatever, it's just something to do. But I also, if a friend has a book out that I think is worthy, I'll send a note to the library and say, you should check out this book. It's worth stocking. And obviously every library has a budget and they can't have every single cookbook. But I think the answer is we feel great about cookbooks in libraries, and we think librarians are awesome. So.
But I think what Lucy's asking about is sometimes, like, I get this when my book comes out, someone goes, oh, I checked it out of the library.
Mm-hmm.
And, as an author, you go, oh man, that's one potential sale gone. And that's not really, my response is, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I hope you love it enough to like get a permanent copy.
Yeah. My library has a cookbook club, and they meet on a monthly basis and review cookbooks, and they do a little potluck and they bring a dish from it. I was invited as a guest to when they did one of my books. And it was the funniest thing because they weren't that interested in me.
They want to catch up with their friends.
Yeah, I was so excited. And they were like, okay, well, thanks for coming. We got to get back to our lunch and our potluck and our, it was just, they'd created this whole community around cookbooks that really it was funny. They didn't really care so much that the author was there. So, but I was thrilled. So all those people doing the cookbook club, I don't know how it works, but you can borrow the book, but then some of those people, they discover a new cookbook and then they might go and buy it, or they might tell someone about it. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Oh, Lucy had this other question that I thought was funny, which is, what the heck is up with a scant or a generous cup?
I use that all the time, man, because it's like, it's just a little bit less or a little bit more.
Like, I guess you don't want to say like 1 cup plus 1 tablespoon.
It sounds so fussy. Yeah.
Sometimes like I'm like mound or rounded cup, measurement. And it's where precision's not going to really matter.
Mm-hmm.
So a scant is just a little bit less and it's going to be okay. Kristin and Kate, you work with chefs who they're always down to the gram, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then when you're translating a recipe for home cooks, like sometimes you got to just kind of finesse. Like, let's say they want 15 tablespoons.
Right.
That becomes a scant / gram measurement.
Or a 3/4 cup plus 3 tablespoons.
Or another thing is it's great for yields. If you make, say, I don't know, maybe it's a chili sauce. And
yes,
it's like you don't want to say make 7/8 of a cup. You want to say makes a scant cup.
Yep.
Yeah. Or a generous cup.
To me, what it implies is flexibility, in that you're not saying, like, if it really needed to be 1 cup and 1 tablespoon, this is why weight measurement would be so much better. But if you're saying a generous cup, you're meaning just load up the cup and don't worry about it. It's, I guess another way to say it would be about a cup. But about a cup, I don't think you'd get away with. So
I use brimming. Are you brimmers?
I like brimming.
And I like it. I've never used it.
Loaded.
I've said generous, I think.
And then I always think of greens, like herbs and other small green that are like packed.
Yeah, gosh.
Packed.
I know, packed,
Yeah.
loosely packed.
Is loosely packed. That's tricky because everybody. I mean, I've seen some people when you say pack, boy, do they pack it?
I know. Loosely packed whole mushrooms. That's a tough one.
That is.
That's
like what, 3
give
mushrooms?
Give me a weight, man.
So that might be a generous cup of mushrooms, right? Because you don't need to try to fit them all in.
Then
Generous
I'm
cup.
like a fistful.
Yeah.
I like handfuls, but then I know there's like my hands are smaller than my husband's hands and
The
all that.
one that a bunch when you get to herbs is.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God.
I try not to use bunch unless there's also another measurement with that.
Yeah, even bunches of scallions or green onions, depending on.
Yeah, you have farmers market scallions.
Oh boy, we're not going to get into the onion scallions
Yes.
debate.
Wait. Here, see, we always devolve into this.
Yeah.
Green onions / scallions.
Yes.
Figure into a lot of stuff that I do.
Hey, I think we have a great last question to end on. This is from Faith Kramer, the author of 52 Shabbats. And Faith asks, how do you get to be a guest on Everything Cookbooks?
It really depends.
It depends.
Yeah, it's a great question because I feel
like everything.
Either there's something that we're really curious about, like we were just talking about librarians. So if there was a librarian out there that wanted to pitch themselves to be on our show, or all ears. I think sometimes we either have a topic we're going after or someone emails us with a very specific pitch. And I'll give you a good example. Molly and I talked to Lucas Folger, who came out with a second edition edition of his very popular veggie burger book. And he wrote us a very clear and kind email talking about the book. It wasn't a pitch, but it just put the book on our radar. And Molly and I thought, we haven't really talked about what it takes to write a second edition. We're kind of curious to what goes into the process. And then this episode naturally sort of formed because he had just popped into our inbox and had a very nice, pleasant conversation with us. And then from there, an idea for an episode kind of formed. Sometimes we do get pitches that are coming from a publicist who's never listened to the podcast, and they're pitching the cookbook as, we're going to talk about this person on how to feed a busy family in under 30 minutes. And that's not our podcast. So that kind of is an example of when someone is pitching and doesn't understand what we talk about. And then it's an easy pass because it's just not a good fit.
Yeah. I mean, like, think about pitching us like you would pitch, honestly, an editor. What are we covering? How would the guest content contribute to the knowledge base of Everything Cookbook's listenership? It can't just be, oh yeah, this is a great, celebrity chili cookbook and you should really be talking to this celebrity. It's like, really? Should we?
But I think back to Kate's point is it's a combination. It's mostly us meeting and talking about things that we would like to take a deep dive into, and then trying to come up with a person who might be able to help us unpack that topic. And then, yes, we do read all the pitches and evaluate them based on what we're trying to cover. Yeah.
We're trying to flesh out a lot of different things. So we're not as obsessed with it being like talking about a brand new cookbook at launch. Sometimes we do that. But a lot of times we're talking to authors whose book is a year or more old, or who have a book coming out in the future, but we maybe heard something really interesting about their writing process. And actually, I do find sometimes it's interesting to talk to people like 6 months or more after their book comes out, because they have all this perspective. They're not in that same like cadence where they're constantly talking to people and they have their patter down.
And I think the four of us, we've come together as colleagues to share because we have very different experiences. Yes, we've all done some things that overlap with others, but that's part of how we communicate and what we value. And so we're really looking for, one thing we've learned in this podcast is there is no one way to write a cookbook.
Right. I was just thinking about, when Susan Spungen came on the podcast, Kristin, you had heard she was shooting all of her photography with an iPhone. So before her book came out, we knew, wow, we've got to see a book that was shot all on an iPhone, and how did this professional food stylist do it? And so it was really interesting to hear that episode where you and Molly talked to her about her process. And it was also great because you knew she was a listener, so she already knew the kinds of stories that we'd want to hear about that were not as focused necessarily on how you make a certain recipe as maybe another kind of food-focused podcast would be, but it's really about the process, the nitty-gritty publishing side, the writing side, the photography side that we're always so interested in.
That comes back to community, because it's like, what if you're listening to this podcast regularly and you have an idea as how to contribute to the knowledge of the Everything Cookbooks community, that's highly valuable to us. So thank you, Faith, for posing that question.
Yeah, thanks to everybody. These were great questions, and we love doing these listener question roundups, and look forward to doing more of them. So keep reaching out. We'll answer. I'm really excited about season 4. We've got a bunch of great interviews and topics lined up for the next few months. We hope you'll tune in and subscribe. Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave us a review. It really helps. Any book mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thank you to our editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.